a great way to do it, but lots of times I know, especially with my students, they just have, a basic sewing machine. So here's a way you can do it with just a basic sewing machine. You don't need a big fancy sewing machine to finish your seam allowances. So the first one here, let me just make a seam really quickly. I can actually show two in this one stitch. Okay. Okay, so one of the ways I tell students to finish their seams, let me cut this in half. You can always just trim your seam allowance. So you would trim it and then just do a zigzag stitch along the edge. So I will switch my machine to a zigzag. And when I switch to zigzag, I like to change my stitch width as well to make that a little wider. And then I would stitch close to this cut edge here. Got dust falling out of my machine. I just recently cleaned my machines and oiled them, so it looks like stuff's still kind of coming out. Okay. So here is one. You just make your straight stitch and then you zigzag along the edge. Then another way you could do it, you make your straight stitch, and say if you want to press your seams open, it just really depends upon the project. So you could press your seams open, and then you could certainly just do a zigzag stitch along this edge, or turn it under. So I would turn my seam under, just turn the end of it in under a little bit. And I'd probably go to the ironing board and iron this, but for the sake of this, I won't. And you could either do a zigzag stitch or a straight stitch. So for this, I'll just do straight. Okay, so your seams would look like this. So if you turn under the seam allowance, you could do a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch. That's another way. Okay, let's see. Then there's also, this one, the French seam I love. It depends on what I'm doing. If it's like a really nice dress, like maybe I'm using sheer fabric or something like that, and I don't want to see any raw edges at all, you can do, it's called a French seam. And so normally you would sew with your right sides together. I always tell the kids right sides together. But if you're doing a French seam, you need to start out with the wrong sides together. So here, that's why I switched to this fabric, so you could see this is the right side and this is my wrong side. So for a French seam, you need to start out with the wrong sides together and just sew your straight stitch. Okay, that's enough for there. And then you would trim your seam allowance. So just, trim really close to your stitching here. Just make sure you don't cut your stitching. So you would trim close to that stitching so that you have almost probably about 1/8 of an inch seam here. So once you've done that, then you turn it to the right side. So you open it up and turn it to the right side, and then you stitch. And same thing, I'd probably, go to the ironing board normally and just press this down for myself. Smooth that out. Okay. And so then here's your seam, here. And then in the inside, it looks like this. So you see no raw edges at all. Okay, and then the next one is called a Hong Kong stitch. I don't know where these names come from, but I promise you these are the real names. Okay, with a Hong Kong stitch, you can use bias tape. You could even just use some ribbon if you wanted to. But for this, I have bias tape that I actually just created myself. And so I'm going to put, it doesn't matter. You could start on the right side of your fabric and flip it over. I'm going to start on the wrong side because I want to see my nice even seam and stitch on the right side. Okay, so you would just open it up and stitch the bias tape. So I'm stitching the bias tape to the wrong side of my fabric. Stop, make sure your needle's up. Okay, and from here you would go and press it towards the press your seam towards the bias tape, but like I said, I'm not doing that here. And then you're just going to fold the bias tape. You know what, I'll probably trim it a little bit so that I don't have this bulk here. Okay, so you do that. Okay, so you trim it a little bit, and then you fold the bias tape over this stitched edge, and you're just covering it up. And then you want to stitch close to the edge of your seam here, or to the edge of the bias tape. Let's see if I can get a little closer so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, just get your stitching in the inside. Okay. People with car alarms kill me, so if you can hear that, the car alarm goes off like every 10 minutes it seems, and they never go outside, so if someone wanted to, they would have already taken the car. Okay, all right, I digress, back to sewing. Okay, so this would be your Hong Kong seam. And so this I love because if you're doing something that say doesn't, sometimes I make jackets that don't necessarily have a lining, so you do the inside of the seam like this, and then that way it looks just as good on the inside, and you see no raw edges, like there's nothing here fraying, you don't see any of your seams or anything like that. So your seam allowance, the cut edge, is within this. So this would be the right side of it, and then the back side just looks like this. So that's your Hong Kong seam, and then this would be your French seam. Okay, and then the other one, let's see. This one, well, obviously if you have a serger, this would be the last one. The serger is the one I love. So it really just depends on your project, because sometimes, you know, a serger won't necessarily work for what it is I'm doing. Let's see if I can move this over here. Okay, turn my light on. Okay, and the serger I love because it sews and cuts, trims your seam allowance. It does everything all at once. But you have to make sure, like my daughter doesn't like doing this, using the serger, because if you make a mistake, it's not forgiving at all, because it's going to cut away your seam allowance. So if you make something and it's, you know, it's a little too snug and you need to let out the stitching, you can't really do that with the serger because it cuts away, you know, this extra fabric here. And with the serger, unlike a regular sewing machine, like I wouldn't just keep sewing. I would finish my garment and then I would stop and pull my thread. But with the serger, you keep sewing to create this tail here. And then you cut it. Okay, so once you serge it, this is what it looks like. So it's completely finished. This looks like, you know, it's from a store. So depending on what I'm doing, you know, sometimes I use that one. And then here's your seam in the inside. I have white thread, otherwise that's why you see a little bit of it, but if it were red, you wouldn't see it at all. And that is it. I think that was probably about maybe 6.